And there you have it. My name is Butch Robins. Welcome to my illusion. I'm going to be talking to you in the next little while about bluegrass music, or what I came to understand as bluegrass music during the last century. And I suppose getting into that, according to Bud Bennett, I need to tell it a little bit of my background in this. I was born in Southwest Virginia in 1949. Moved to Alabama in 1953 when my dad became a part of a government project called the Tennessee Valley Authority. And they were bringing electricity into the southeast of the United States for mass consumption at that point. We were in Bridgeport, Alabama for about a year, then we moved to Keville, Kentucky for about a year, and we settled in Rogersville, Tennessee. I started school there in 1955. Went halfway through my fourth grade, we moved to Asheville, North Carolina. And while we were in the area there, we were there from 58 through the summer of 63 when we moved back into Virginia. But during the period of time when we lived in North Carolina, I was introduced to a banjo. My father was actually trying to find one of the things for the children of a friend of his. And he came across this old guy that I've got around here. I'll show it to you in a second. Bought it in a barber shop one Saturday morning for $2. And thank you, Bud. He brought it home and he sewed up the head right here and here with fishing line. And besides being dizzy when I would try to look at where I was on the fingerboard, this is the instrument that I started playing on in the latter part of 1962. So here we be in March of 1963. I've been playing a little bit over a half a century on one of these things. When I started out playing, there was, it was sort of a hand-me-down deal that came down through the households and everything, or if you had groups around in the area that played. You'd go out and get involved, and if you liked a particular instrument or something caught your fancy about it, you might pick it up and try to learn to play it. So most of the way that I learned to play was simply through observation. I never had any formal lessons as such, but in this string band music that came from the Celtic descended region of the United States that we live in, the 7-state region of the South here. That's just the way music was handed down back in those days. And my father was a great one for seeking out information. When I first took up an instrument in the banjo, he had me, any banjo he could play, player he could find within a 50-mile radius. I was in front of that guy, and that guy was telling me how to put on my picks or how to make a 3-finger roll. Finally settled in with one old fella near home by the name of Homer Israel, who had a right hand that was much like a clock ticking right along. And I came to find later on that the style that he played in was very closely related to the style that Snuffy Jenkins brought into being as a result of his endeavors with the banjo, and I'll talk about that later on in my presentation. We wound up moving back to Virginia in 1963. By the time in the fall, my father started teaching at New River Vocational Technical School in Radford, Virginia. When the school became incorporated into the community college system by Dr. Hamill, I think it was. He was in Mills Godwin's administration. My father bailed out and went into a vocational program in the high school when the school moved up to Dublin and became New River Community College. At that point, I was playing in contests. My father was taking me to contests anywhere that we could go, and the interaction with people there, I was able to learn a lot in a relatively short amount of time around Galax, Union Grove. The tune that I just played for you there, 40 Years Late, was written after Galax in 1965, I believe. Tommy Jarrell shared with me that C minor tuning. And I think a little bit later on in that same evening, I was sitting around fiddling around with it, and a fiddle player by the name of Buddy Pendleton came up and strummed across the banjo. He played a little bit himself, and he played a tune out of that C minor. He was familiar with that tuning, so I was able to hear a little bit played on it down there. And I think when I got home the next week, I think that tune right there popped out of my banjo within a week or two after that particular thing. But anyhow, to get on through that, and by the time I was midway through high school, it was already being considered that music would become a career for me. And we had moved back here into Virginia and fallen into an area that was saturated at that point by a band, Don Reno, Red Smiley, and the Tennessee Cut-Ups. And Don Reno sort of took me under his wing, talking to me about, what I was going to have to be as if I had designs set on being a professional musician, the disciplines that I would have to undergo as a player to get myself in shape where I could execute these jobs, and also the way that I needed to think a little bit about my personal conduct. With he and Red both, boy oh boy, I should have listened a lot closer, I guess. But anyhow, when I got out of high school in 1967, I got a job with Bill Monroe. That was my first introduction. I had been introduced to him by Carlton Haney a few years earlier, met him at the first Fingassel Festival. He and my dad made it up there that I had to graduate from high school, and when I did, I would have a job with him on the Grand Ole Opry. Okay, we're onward and upward here now. So far, I've gotten myself out of high school, and I've gone to work for Bill Monroe in Nashville, Tennessee. Like most of my trips to Nashville, Tennessee, that proved to be a very bittersweet journey. I didn't last very long. I think I worked the first Bean Blossom Festival with Bill, was the only thing of significance that year in 1967. But it wasn't long after that that I came back home, wound up signing up to go to school up here at New River to try to dodge the draft. I went over there for a couple of years, went out that next year and rode around with Monroe all summer in 1969, but the school-going business had been postponing the inevitable. I was drafted in 1969. Went to Columbia, South Carolina, and had a wonderful 2 years down there because I was introduced to the fella that sort of invented this, or popularized it. I'll go into a little bit about three-finger banjo playing here, because I ain't going to do much of that during the presentation on bluegrass. But Smith Hammond and Rex Brooks had occasion to see a classical banjo player. I think it was Fred Van Epps who came through the South, and he was playing in a minstrel show, and he played with all his fingers. So these guys go back home, and they come up these little three-fingered rolls. Both of those guys did. And that's where Snuffy told me that he got it from. They were the first ones that he ever heard do it. So anyhow, one of them, as a matter of fact, and when I play bare-fingered a lot, it happens to me, put a blister on this middle finger here, and subsequently wound up playing like Jerry Garcia with thumb, middle, ring finger to make his roll, where Mr. Garcia was missing that middle finger or the end of it. But anyhow, to get on with the banjo development and how it came and all this stuff, Snuffy adapted the style. Now, Snuffy was the first of those cats who, from his beginning in life, he was destined to be an entertainer, a pure entertainer. He played guitar and clawhammer banjo at that time. When he picked up the style, he was the first one to put on picks and play it. He was the first one to play it on the radio. He was the first one to record it. And he was the first one to use it who was a full-time entertainer. And all those guys down there, the Don Renos and Earl Scruggs and those folks that heard him, it was basically Snuffy that pulled this thing off the ground. But anyhow, I learned that during my time down there, learned how wonderful it was to play with him because I experienced rhythm, not necessarily with his banjo playing, but I got to play the banjo in the band when he was playing on the washboard. And I learned a little bit about rhythm beyond the backbeat technique of a guitar or the backbeat strum of a mandolin or chop or whatever you want to call that. Anyhow, before I got out of the military, I went to work for an old boy named Charlie Moore when we did the original cuts of a song that he had that became popular called Rebel Soldier. I was AWOL at that particular time, but I stayed out a couple of days because it was my first experience to ever work with Chubby Wise, and a wonderful experience it was. Wonderful fiddle player. Anyhow, after Charlie, I went to Nashville, Tennessee, jobbed around in and out of a place called the Pickin' Parlor down on 2nd Avenue, wound up with some crazy diverse jobs out of that thing. I was in the Las Vegas area with the Harry James Orchestra, or part of that whole show for a while. Wound up on tour with Leon Russell. I had done a recording session and he asked that I put together some kind of little band that could go out on tour with him, and I got some friends of mine who had a band called the Bluegrass Revival to go do that tour. And a time after that, I actually became a member of that band. I played bass in that group for 14, 16 months, something like that. I thought it was a 3-month fill-in while they found somebody, and it wound up putting me on an instrument that I wasn't comfortable with, and all kinds of stuff happened. That's where I really got turned on to Bill Monroe. Sam Bush, at that point I didn't have a whole lot of use for Bill Monroe. My experience with him in '67 hadn't been all that pleasant. And Sam told me I ought to listen to this guy because there was something that was extraordinarily different about him as a musician. And I came to find out that that was the case. Anyhow, was with the Bluegrass Revival for a while, got out of that, had great reluctance to go around the new Grand Ole Opry that they had built over in a park over across the river. I was one of them old-timey guys like Norman Blake and thought that had been sort of an abomination when they moved the Opry away from Lower Broadway. But anyhow, I went to work for a fellow who softened my heart and changed my mind and was one of the most wonderful fellows I ever worked for. His name was Stoney Cooper. It was in the Wilma Lee and Stoney Cooper Act on the Grand Ole Opry. Did that till about 6 months after Stoney passed. And at that point, I went back to work for Bill Monroe and went through a 4-year rocket ride of learning about music and about musical art and about just about everything else that I can think of. It was all about what I know when I wrote it down a few years back. Anyhow, I spent 4 years with him, or the better part of it. After that, I spent a little over a year with a group that I started called the Bluegrass Band. And after that, I just quit. I walked away from it. The frustration, I started recognizing in myself mental health issues that were extraordinary enough. I thought I should go get professional counsel to deal with them. And part of the dealing of it was, for a while, I just had to walk away from music and everything else. About 10 years after that, a guy came into my office over in Christiansburg and wanted to make some records to put on TV, like the old Boxcar Willie things. Kerry Hay, his name was. He did these. I helped him make a set of records, and we got him on TV, and he was successful enough with it that he was able to start a record label. Well, I wound up working around that label for him for a while and producing some other things. I made 2 packages of recordings for him, and then all of a sudden, something happened. I had been asked to make another Butch Robins record. I had done records for about 10 or 15 years at that point under the name the Bluegrass Band. And I'd always thought that my Butch Robins records were my banjo records, and the others were attempts at ensemble sound that, you know, didn't stress the banjo so much. So anyhow, I started putting together this record, which I subsequently called Grounded, Centered, Focused. I went to Nashville, Tennessee to make the recording, and the second day into the project, I woke up that morning and I'd had a bad experience the day before. My fiddle player hadn't shown up to the sessions. So I'm out at Mr. Monroe's house and I tell him that I've had a fiddle player to lay down on me, that I need somebody to come in and help me out. And he turned around and asked some folks that were helping him out what he was doing this afternoon, and they allowed as to how nothing was the case. So he said he might meet me at the studio. Well, I left. I'd been trying for years to get him to record with me. I left with no particular idea that that would happen. But I got to the studio an hour and a half early to the sessions, and he was sitting in the parking lot waiting. And all those years of being away from music, I'd had an opportunity to think a lot about it and everything. But all of a sudden, here I'm in a recording session, and I've got my ultimate musical hero there. Well, we did the first day, and it was wonderful. I was so excited, I don't know that my feet touched the ground for 8 or 10 hours after it was over. But the next morning, I got a call from the old guy, and he said, "No, I'm not going to know Monroe imitations here." He asked what we were doing that day, and when I asked what he was sort of hinting at, he said, "Well, the music sounded awful good. It would be good if we could do that again." So the studio where I was doing my record had been booked. We wound up going to Vic Gabaney, who was the Opryland sound guy. He had a vocational program out at Hillsborough High School. We went to his studios and made the second day of the recording. The third day that I woke up, my feet ain't even on the ground, but the phone's ringing, and when I pick it up, it's Bill Monroe on the other end of it, making me take out a notebook and a pencil and a paper, or a pencil to go along with it, or a pen, and write down the names of all the reviewers in town that could possibly review my record. and all the DJs and anybody else in town who might be able to help me promote that thing once it came out. Told me to call up Harold Hensley over at WSM, go do a radio interview. Said to tell Harold that he was going to come along to do the interview, you know. And it was something that was amazing to me because for years I'd had discussions with John Hartford on the relative nature of Monroe's intellect. And, you know, how somebody so brilliant in the arena of music could continue making the same mistakes all his life that caused him financial problems. Well, he had very few close relationships in his life, as far as I knew. But anyhow, how that whole recording incident and episode got me enthused about playing music again and starting to dabble in it for one thing. But it also got me even more interested in the career of Bill Monroe. So that's probably working my way this way. It's in an understanding, it was in an understanding to try to understand or to try to figure out what had caused the term bluegrass to be come up with in the first place. This is probably going to get cut because this is garbled here. This is just a thought. But I got interested in the guy and his career and the whole thing across the board. And that's what the subsequent documentary or whatever it is that we're doing this comes as a result of that thought for about 5 years after that, before I finally realized and understood it was somebody else's cross to bear. I wrote about it in my book, in the very end of it, in a book of Pickett's things. I can't play bluegrass music under my definition of what that music is. I never could. I could only accompany it while it was alive. It had had its own life force under it that was very, very different from the life force that's under the music of me. And if the music that comes out of me was complimentary of him when I was with there, if I tried to compliment him in every way that I could, I'm hoping that I did a fairly good job of it. But anyhow, I'm going to depart for this. There ain't nothing else to be said, except I've got to a place in my life at age 63 that I hear people talking about bluegrass music, and it's a rock and roll band that happens to have a banjo in it. And I think that's very unfortunate. I will voice this again at the end of my presentation. But under today's terms, if Roy Acuff, the very king of country music, one of the cornerstones of the Country Music Hall of Fame, patriarch of the Grand Ole Opry for over 50 years, were he to walk out on stage today with his fiddle and his dobro and his banjo with Oz there and Charlie on the guitar and Howdy over there playing the fiddle, if he were to walk out on stage with that act, he would be introduced as a bluegrass band. And I just really think that's a travesty. And I'm willing to sit here and go through this process of making another fool out of myself to try to explain why I think that to be the case. I'm going to be talking about a music that bridged a gap. It came into being somewhere in the mid-40s. But the career of this guy that I'm talking about started when he first started going out to where he was playing. He rode on horseback or rode in a wagon. By the time it was over with, he had his cars, he had his stretch limousines, he had his buses, he was traveling on planes. The whole thing of the last century and the mass transportation thing we did, all the interstate highways he saw built in his lifetime. The first paved road, cross-country paved road we had in the Lee Highway, that happened in his lifetime. And that was a major route for him getting up in this part of the country where he was fairly popular in those days. Mass transportation, mass communication. They had a Victrola in the new house. Buck brought one in Bill's father brought one in The last two children were born in the new house, and they had a Victrola record player in that. And there was a radio about. But this guy made the bridge from radio, television, into movies, all that stuff. The recorded media, when he started recording, they put a needle down on a piece of acetate, and they made your record right there. It had that first performance, you better get it. He makes it all the way up there into vinyl multi-track recording, and then into the cartridge tapes and the cassette tapes and the CDs. And before he died, you could download him off the internet. That whole thing and that whole arising of a medium there to record music, you know, to capture music art for the posterity and all of that. So it's interesting times we'll be talking about. The other thing is talking about too, and not doing it in a sarcastic way, how each new generation rewrites history to its own design. A lot of times you find out in music forms, you know, if you study somebody like Bob Wills out there. And then all of a sudden they pick up on this particular musician, or if you're a great Ernest Tubb fan, and all the generation that comes along knew it was Ernest Tubb. But that next generation discovers Billy Byrd too, who was his ace guitar playing sideman. So that next generation writes Billy Byrd in a bigger role in the history of that music. And the next generation finds somebody else that was in that band in the next one. So history is constantly being rewritten by people that are coming along digging up information. It's also being rewritten by people who, young folks thinking they got a better idea than the old folks. Now, therein lies a real problem. And it's a problem we've got in our culture as it comes of age here. I'll be talking about art in this, and if I get redundant, it's up to you guys to cut it out. Art, that of human contrivance which stimulates the human intellect. What else are you going to say about it that doesn't cover? So what proves it to be? Is it some reviewer's notification of what he thinks about it, or how many records it sells? If it is, my God, we're going to be blessed with achy, breaky heart till the end of time. But unfortunately, it won't be hanging on the wall beside the Mona Lisa. Time proves art to be. There ain't nothing else that proves it to be what it is. Because if it stimulated the intellect in the 1700s when it was drawn or written as a piece of music or something, and it still does that today, you may be on to something. If it still captured the imagination of an audience 100 years after it was written or performed or drawn, then you may be on to something. And those are the qualities that are absolutely unpredictable. This man over here heard me years and years before he ever met me on those recordings. I had an interesting thing happen at Bean Blossom one year. I had this guy come up to my record table. He bought fragments of my Magic Nation and the Fifth Child. He came back the next day. He held up the Fifth Child and said, "That's one of the best records I ever heard in my life." He took fragments out, broke it, threw it down on the table, said, "This is one of the worst piles of shit I ever heard." And I promptly said, "Hey, I got a whole box full of them back here if you want to do that same act," because I needed the money, you know. I go into 20 years later, almost 15 years later, I go into a farmhouse in Japan where they're doing a banjo workshop that day, or I was doing a banjo workshop. And I walk into a room that had 35 banjo players in it that were my students for the day and my two translators. They were trying to keep up with me. When I walked through that door, 35 human beings stood up there with their banjos on, and they played one of the tunes off the record that guy had broken. And I cried. We never know, you know, when we start putting stuff like this nonsense that you're doing here right now. You know, folks are rewriting history to their own design. I've had folks put in front of me what a wonderful bluegrass band they are and everything, and they are. They're the best pickers that are out there today. I just experienced a guy here in the last month who may be technique-wise the greatest mandolin player I ever played with. He's 24 years old and from that hotbed of bluegrass, South Dakota. You know, the musicians today are better than they've ever been. They're technically more accomplished at an early age. Yet the music, everybody's saying it don't sound like it used to. Individual bands don't have individual sounds that are recognizable. It's all this amalgamation out there of everything. You know, in art, you look around you, you don't see much like the pictures of the trees over here on the wall. You see more of abstraction and graphic design out there. A lot of abstract, surrealistic. In your music, you got jam band music. You got bands out there where you've got salsa being played in amongst a polka, you know, that it's just all amalgam. And that in itself is a reflection of a society that's unsure of itself. That's a reflection of humanity being questioning where it is and where it's going now as much or more than it ever has in the past. Because we've lost the idea of these solid building blocks. I'm going to be able to show you that in this presentation of bluegrass. Monroe's music was the first of the fusion musics as far as I can tell. Before he came along, there was a very definable beat to blues music. There was a very definable pace and rhythm to country blues music of that day. There's a whole different thing with swing music that was out there. Of, you know, the rhythms within the different things, the march rhythms that he would play. He was trying to show me that. We were working on a thing. It was another off-take like McKinley's March or something that he was working on for a while. And he was showing me on the mandolin the difference in a march rhythm and, you know, just a standard rhythm that we were playing in the second half of that, how you changed it internally. Those solid foundation blocks when he gets together. These guys that are coming out here now that are saying that they're putting jazz together with country together with this, it was already an amalgam. What they learned was already an amalgamation before they even more amalgamated it. And now there's no direction, there are no sounds. There are only real good PR people and marketing agents out there. To where, again, we can be led by those with the least experience amongst us. We like youth in this culture. We've done so ever since the 50s. We've put that at the head of everything. We've lost respect for the wisdom of age around anything, even the game of golf now. We're wanting to make it more popular, get more people on the golf course because it means more money. Also, means more hassle when regular golfers get there too, for all the people that don't spend the time on the driving range. And it don't matter if, according to the way Jack does it, you increase the size of the hole 1.5 inches, or the new guys do it if you've got a putter that anchors to the body, or whatever it is. A respect for an institution 400 or 500 years old, let's don't have that. Let's change it so we can bring it into what we are today. Because if we do that 10 years down the road, you won't even be able to recognize it for what it is. That whole condition we do all around us. And I'm going to be able to show it to you point blank, specifically when I talk to you about bluegrass music.